I lurked in a pseudo-minstrel gallery, seemingly unnoticed, allowing me to witness my daughter's wedding without being seen by anyone on the main hall floor. Welcome to the Butterfly Tumblr Radio channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. The building was large and, I must admit, impressive, for some inexplicable reason. The modern exterior hid an interior designed in the style of an ancient baronial castle, similar to the luxurious film sets you sometimes see in movies, essentially a Victorian interpretation of the ideal medieval castle. They didn't really have the technology to build large or extravagant buildings like in the real old days. One thing I knew for sure: the wedding would not have taken place in such an establishment if I had paid the bills. But hey, years ago my ex-wife Eleanor was damn sure it would never happen. I really thought I had found myself a safe, secluded spot hidden in a pseudo-minstrel gallery that doubled as a spotlight tower and movie booth. From there, I could watch the ceremony without being seen by anyone on the main hall floor below. I was well aware that my presence, if it became known, would prove, to put it mildly, somewhat controversial and would likely lead to an unfortunate confrontation between my former relatives and me. And I was also quite convinced that my daughter would not be happy if this happened. I even imagined that Tamzon would be even less pleased to learn of my presence than the witch and George, her henchman husband. Anyway, I was sitting there quietly hidden in the depths of the usually ignored minstrel gallery, where I could watch my daughter's wedding, when suddenly a voice whispered right in my ear. "Hi, handsome." I thought you wouldn't refuse this little party. To say that the sound of that voice made me flinch would be putting it mildly. I literally jumped off the folding fishing chair I was sitting on and collapsed on the floor. Yes, I thought that if I sat crouched on this little stool and watched the ceremony between the parapet bars, there would be less chance of anyone noticing me. The noise that the little aluminum chair made as it fell and then skidded across the stone floor of the minstrel gallery was such that any chance of my presence remaining a secret instantly evaporated from my new position. Lying on my back on the floor, I looked up and saw trouble towering over me. My daughter's aunt, looking very embarrassed, made frantic apologetic gestures with her hands towards the hall below. Grace, or Trouble, as I humorously nicknamed her in our younger years, was, at least at the time, my ex-wife's mischievous little sister. Grace was so often the bane of our courtship years. A glance between the parapet bars told me that my refuge had suddenly become the center of attention of almost everyone in the building: bride, groom, priest, photographer, choir, cameraman, and the about. Most of the parishioners. They all looked at Grace with an irritated and somewhat puzzled expression on their faces. So I laid out as far as I could on the floor and prayed that none of the bastards would spot me. Grace, then signaling that the service could continue, picked up my little stool and delicately plopped up her ass on it. From my prone position I could no longer see the floor of the main hall, but I could almost hear what was happening below and soon really see that the wedding service had resumed. I was kind of hoping that this incident would register as one of Grace's stunts. Grace's penchant for extravagant behavior and accidents was legendary in the family, even when she was a child. "It's okay. You can watch now," Grace whispered. "Sorry, I didn't mean to make you jump." "Alex, make me jump. Woman. Damn it. You almost gave me a heart attack. Where did you learn to sneak up like that, Grace?" I whispered, taking a position from which I could observe what was happening below. Well, it was obvious to me that I wouldn't be able to use my little chair for a while. Oh, I kind of picked it up as a kid, sneaking up on a couple of lovers I once knew. She looked down and winked at me. "You're a cheeky little monkey. Not so little anymore, Alex boy. Just watch your step, otherwise you might end up raped." "Oh no, I won't, Grace. I'm leaving this damn hellhole by train at 4:30. Grace looked down at me again. She made a strange but strangely familiar gesture with her eyes, which seemed to me to imply, "Do you think so?" And then she pointed to the service below, effectively informing me that the conversation was to pause until the ceremony was completed. I've always liked Eleanor's little sister. Yes, she was a real pain in the ass at times during Eleanor and I's courtship, but Eleanor was always less tolerant of trouble's antics than I was. Grace always struck me as basically a good-hearted child who demanded attention. There was a good for years difference between the two sisters, and this was a cause for contention. I always assumed that Grace simply didn't understand that her older sister and I certainly needed a little privacy from time to time. The service ended. I did my best to get a good look at the groom as he led Tamsin out of the hall. The viewing angle made this difficult. If I wanted to stay out of sight from what I could tell about this guy, he seemed decent enough. Luckily, everyone seemed completely focused on the bride and groom, so I don't think anyone even glanced at the minstrel gallery again. But the moment the motorcade disappeared from view below us, Grace began trying to pull me to my feet. "Come on, Alex. It's time for us to go down to the dining room." I struggled against Grace's desperate tug on my arm, trying to stay safely out of sight until all the guests had left the room. "Grace, there's no way in hell I'll show up at this party. Lord, I'll end up in prison." "Don't be stupid. Alex, this is your own daughter's wedding. Why would the police arrest you?" "Well, for starters, there's this damn restraining order," I exploded. "No, Alex Eleanor is now dead, and she's the only one mentioned in this restraining order. When he killed her, this order instantly became invalid." "What do you mean when you say he killed her?" I demanded, almost jumping to my feet. "It was a car accident. It wasn't it, Alex. That damn always drove like a goddamn idiot and still does for that matter. This weirdo was a disaster waiting to happen every time he got behind the damn wheel. Do you have any idea how fast he was driving that day? I know very little about this, Grace. I saw skid marks on the road, Alex, that evening. He drove like an idiot. Like always. I just can't understand how he wasn't brought to justice for my sister's murder. Even Tamsin knows who is to blame for her mother's death. You probably noticed that he wasn't there today. He wasn't invited. I wasn't there either, Grace. No, you were a detour. I just couldn't find you to tell you about it. Look, my invitation says Miss Grace Stone and guess no reservations or anything. Guess who was supposed to be my guest?" I laughed out loud. "You've got to be kidding me, Grace. For me to show up at the Stones' wedding, there was already one attempt. And remember, girl, how it turned out in the long run. The fact that my sister was a stupid cow has nothing to do with this. Alex, you are Tamsin's father and, oh God, you should have been handing her over to her fiancé today, not her grandfather. Anyway, you and I are going to an appointment together, and I don't want to hear any crap about restraining orders. My Uncle Albert has assured me that there is no legal reason why you should not be present as my guest. In fact, he thinks it's a damn good idea. You know, he was always there for you, even when things got confusing. I was kind of surprised why the old scoundrel didn't introduce Shauna. I commented, "Look, Alex, if my Uncle Albert thought he could get away with this, I'm damn sure he'd represent you for free." He was not at all impressed with my sister's behavior at the time, and he actually blamed her and my mom and dad for it. He pointedly refused to represent Helena's interests. As far as I know, since then he and my mother have not said two polite words to each other. The only time I saw them in the same room together was at Eleanor's funeral. I think Uncle Albert was a little disappointed that you didn't show up that day. I wasn't even in the country. Grace, I provided security for a film crew filming the fauna and flora of South Georgia after these people were trapped by the Argentine invasion. Well, they prefer to have me on the ship nearby if possible. In any case, I knew nothing about Shauna's incident until we returned to the UK 3 months after our funeral. In foul mouth, I ran into Toby, or whatever his name was, and he told me about the accident. Listening to my explanation, Grace pulled me to my feet and was busy brushing the dust off my suit. "Come on, Alex," Grace continued. let us go down to the reception before the group of greeters disperses. I knew from the way Grace grabbed my hand tightly that whether I supported the idea or not, Grace had decided that I would attend my daughter's wedding reception against my better judgment. I guess I seemed to admit defeat. I have to say that this was probably solely due to the considerable amount of alcohol I had consumed over the previous 24 hours. This clouded my judgment just enough to allow me to agree with Grace's wishes. Okay, let me explain better. When Eleanor and I first broke up, I have to admit that I didn't handle the situation as well as I could have. I actually ended up spending more than a few days as a guest of the US authorities, or at least local law enforcement. When I took on a little administrative work retribution, I gave the new man in Eleanor's life a little thrashing. It could be a spur of the moment and somewhat satisfying exercise, but it turned out to be very wrong in the long run. The confrontation didn't end the way I expected, and the argument resulted in me getting a solid kick in the ass. You see, unfortunately, somehow Eleanor got involved in the whole thing, which led to her ending up in the nearest emergency room. Hence my imprisonment and numerous court orders issued in both US and UK jurisdictions, permanently banning me from coming within a mile or so Eleanor's whereabouts. Almost be that as it may, I can assure the reader that I personally have never laid a finger on my errant wife. Well, at least not as far as I know. I'm sure this statement will probably make a little more sense to you later. Where did I stop? Oh yeah. Anyway, after the courts had their way, I found myself an EXC on unlabeled a bully and a wife beater, and after a fight, my parental rights to our daughter Tamsin were unceremoniously terminated. By the way, almost all of this happened while I was still in prison in the US. Not a very pleasant experience, I can assure you. Keep in mind there was nothing fun in my life at that time. The EXC on label didn't help much in my work career either. Trying to get us work visa with a track record like this. Although this did not stop Shona, with the assistance of the British legal system, from demanding financial support from me for terms on until the child turned 18. Not very proud, but I have to admit that after the system kicked my ass so effectively, I found solace in drinking for a while. However, I managed not to become a complete wreck or an inveterate alcoholic, but that probably depended more on my inherited biological makeup rather than any mental will. If you know what I'm getting at. However, I still needed a little something to help me face this particular day still working in the film industry. Alex Grace asked, leading me somewhat unsteadily down the stairs into the main foyer of the establishment. No, not really, Grace, I replied. I guess you could say I'm in the shipping business now most of the time. I work as a sailor on research vessels and the like. Although I still do quite a bit of filming, I think it's a good idea for them to have a backup or second experienced cameraman on the team to help document what's going on. Sometimes I'm the only operator on board. So you gave up Hollywood, Grace? I never worked for any of the big boys. The best thing I've ever done was be a background cameraman. Moreover, in rather mediocre third-rate films. Unfortunately for me, my wife was far more successful with directors and producers than my work ever was. Ellen always wanted to be a star. Alex, you knew this before you married her. Yes, but I had no idea how far she would go to achieve her dream. Oh damn, look at this. We arrived at the hotel lobby, through which we had to pass to get to the entrance to the banquet hall, where the reception of guests on the occasion of the wedding was to be organized. The vast space was filled with guests patiently queuing to join the hosts and guests of honor. As they greeted those arriving at the reception, I decided that the show was planned by the witch, Grace and Eleanor's mother, and she really put in her best effort. The witch still has greater delusions of grandeur than my ex-wife. The witch planned and organized our wedding, although it was not as big as this reception. I might add that the witch and I were never members of each other's respective fan clubs, so I decided that my appearance at this function could go disastrously wrong. Finding myself buried anonymously in the crowd, I no longer felt so vulnerable. although many of our dear guests and relatives quickly glanced at each other, as they recognized me, probably from Elena and I's wedding many years ago. I also knew that somewhere Ira had several allies, but they would remain strictly secret. In general, the Stones were a fairly friendly clan. Eventually, however, the crowd began to thin out and the witch finally noticed me from her place a little further down the line of hosts. Her face immediately turned crimson and for a moment I thought I saw smoke coming from her ears, even though I protested. Grace led me through the conference room entrance to the front of the reception line. Lily's new husband was momentarily stunned and Grace introduced him to the bride's father. The poor guy really didn't know what to do or say. I shook a very limp hand. Lily was just as shocked, if not more so, as I looked into her eyes. They grew larger and larger until I was afraid they were about to pop out of their sockets. You know, I truly believe that the girl had no idea who I was until she heard her Aunt Grace tell her young husband that I was Tamsin's father. For some inexplicable reason, I decided to say, "Hey, baby, it's been a while since I sat you on my lap." Before taking the equally limp hand, she extended and kissed the back of it. Okay, I was actually thinking about giving Tamsin a big hug, but I was afraid she might faint if I did. Lily's answer was limited to "but" before Grace nudged me with her elbow, directing me along the line of greeters. The next person who came into my field of vision was the witch's henchman George. He actually recognized me and handled the situation quite well. Well, I thought he would do it. "William, well, this is an unexpected surprise. How are you be as my guest, Daddy?" "If he leaves, I will leave too," Grace commanded, standing next to me. I kind of wondered if Grace had even spoken to Tamsin. It seemed to me that there was simply no time for this. I wasn't going to suggest that Grace answered the old brat. "Of course William is welcome here today. I'm just surprised he ended up in the country. Your mother assured me that he's currently working somewhere on the other side of the globe." I worked in Antarctica. "Sir, I have no idea why I addressed this idiot as sir out of habit. I guess 5 weeks ago my ship docked in New Zealand." I told the old eccentric, "You see, Grace, your mother actually tried to contact William. I guess you got her message." "William, your mother told you she would contact William." "Grace, you are very welcome here today, my boy." As he spoke, George constantly switched his attention from Grace to me and back whatever he said. I was sure there was no message. In the age of modern electronic communications, things are pretty good. It's just occasionally interrupted by extreme weather on the onshore platforms. So despite all the old man's assurances to the contrary, I was absolutely sure that I had never been included in the guest list, even tentatively. I was convinced of this by the fact that my former mother-in-law had disappeared from the reception line by the time we got to our place. I kind of wondered if she rushed off to call the police or something. Lily's new in-laws were polite, pleasant, and obviously very embarrassed. They didn't look like they'd seen a ghost. It's better described as shock finding them shaking hands with me personally. I would say so. It's all quite funny from my point of view, but it made me wonder what exactly they were told about Tamsin's father. Most of the other guests had no idea who I was, so as we left the reception line, we were looked at rather with curiosity, probably because they didn't understand why Grace had decided to watch the wedding ceremony from minstrel galleries. I, like everyone else, grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waitress and downed it in one gulp. After I grabbed the second glass, Grace told me to slow down in no uncertain terms. Then the imposing figure of Sir Albert Stone appeared in the crowd. I was kind of wondering why Uncle Albert wasn't included in the receiving line. He was usually considered the patriarch of the whole damn clan. "William, my boy, it's so nice to see you here today. HIN made me believe that you are abroad and will not be able to attend," said Albert, holding out his hand for me to shake. I can't say I ever liked that old brat. Grace's Uncle Albert is a lawyer by trade, and in my opinion, he always seemed too official. In my youth, I felt a natural disgust for people like him. Disgust which has since intensified somewhat due to my meeting with the lawyers. However, Grace implied that during the train wreck that ended my marriage, the old goat took my side. As a result, I was forced to do a quick reevaluation of my feelings towards this character. "How are you, sir?" I found myself responding by shaking his hand. "It's nice to meet you again." Capital Albert grinned back at me. I actually don't know what the phrase capital is supposed to mean nor imply, but I knew from memories that this was Uncle Albert's usual reaction to almost anything and everything that was ever said to him. That is, as long as everything went the way the old coder wanted it. At that moment, Tamsin, on her duties on the receiving line apparently completed, appeared in front of me. In fact, completely forgetting her manners, Tamsin rather rudely pushed herself between me and her Uncle Albert. The look on Tamsin's face can only be described as one of naked disgust. "You have some kind of cover. Since you showed up here, what do you need? Some kind of handout or something? Or did you just want to embarrass me?" Lily demanded, albeit surprisingly quietly. I suppose I should point out here that Tamsin's words and the way she phrased them were straight out of the witch's repertoire. It wasn't my daughter talking to me. It was Tamsin who was brainwashed by the witch shortly after she was born. This realization was disappointing, but I didn't feel the same way about Tamsin as she did about me. It just reassured me that everything was as I expected. I looked from my daughter to Albert and then to Grace standing next to me. "I told you this wasn't a good idea, Grace. I'd better leave now," I said and turned to the exit. "No, just a minute." Young man Albert shouted loud enough to attract the attention of almost everyone standing nearby and with enough authority to stop me instantly. I turned around wondering what the old man was going to say. "Lily, your father traveled almost halfway around the world to be here with you on your special day. The least you can do is be polite to him." In fact, Albert's statement was not true. I almost always spend the summer months in the UK. Most of my work on the ship in the available history took place in Antarctic waters, but at this time of year, there's very little going on there. My daughter looked, I don't know, I guess you would call it puzzled. She looked from me to her uncle, to all the people watching us, and then back to me. Then she said, "Sorry, Father. Your unexpected presence took me by surprise. You never pretended to be interested in my life. Where did you get this idea?" Tam and Albert roared. "I want you to know, young lady, that your father has been very closely monitoring your development. He repeatedly risked being arrested only to witness important incidents in your life. Isn't that right, young man?" "Sorry, sir," I began to answer. But Albert, moving ahead, continued to say, "Giving prizes at that damn stupid, expensive school your mother insisted on sending you to. I have very good reason to believe that your father was present for each of them. He was also at your university graduation. Damn girl, you walked right next to your dad to pick up your diploma without him even noticing. He knew who you were, but you didn't recognize him. Mind you, your mother didn't find out either, which may have saved your father a visit to the local magistrate's court. I didn't know you were there." Uncle Albert Tamsin dared to say I wasn't Tamsin, at least not as regularly as I would like. "Your mother and I had our differences. You know that. But I have people who have been my following your development all these years, and they were able to recognize your father. It wouldn't do for one of them to accidentally break your father's cover, would it? When your mother was around, your father's presence was technically illegal. I would advise you, Tamsin, to smile sweetly and forget about your imaginary differences with your father. I assure you, he, or rather your father's reputation in your eyes, has always been a victim of circumstances coupled with your late mother's extremely poor judgment. Let's call a family truce for this special day." "Okay." By this time my daughter looked quite embarrassed. "If you insist." Uncle Tamsin conceded, then added, "But I have to wonder what his motivation was for coming here today." Then Tamzon turned her back to me and walked away into the crowd. After watching her retreat, Albert turned to me. William, I'm afraid your daughter has only ever heard a very one-sided story about her parents' divorce. And the fact that you and Hin didn't see eye to eye from the very beginning made it even worse. I was never good enough for Eleanor in her mother's eyes. Sir, I answered, no one could ever be good enough for Hyacinth. William, I don't think even my brother fits that description in my sister-in-law's eyes. However, it looks like Hyacinth might throw in the towel. She's up there on the D's, obviously rearranging the seats at the top table. Sure enough, when I looked, the witch, with the help of her ever-bumbling henchman in the form of husband George, did indeed appear to be rearranging the seating arrangement. As we watched, I saw one of the photographers approach them. The witch spoke briefly with the guy then. Hyacinth was obviously pleased with her rearrangement. The small retinue left the platform. They're getting ready for group photos. Alex, it's time for us to go. Grace quietly told me no. Go ahead. Grace Tamzon isn't very happy that I'm here. Besides, I would look completely out of place in photographs without that monkey tuxedo suit. It would ruin the whole aesthetic. Alex, don't argue. Grace, I'm still on the verge of quitting. I knew this wasn't a good idea. After a few more protests, not only from Grace but also from her uncle Albert, I was left alone and everyone went outside for a photo shoot. Much to my relief, almost all the other guests also came out into the hotel garden to participate or watch. I took the opportunity to slip onto the platform and do a little rearranging myself. Of course, the witch sat me down next to Tamzon's new husband, but given my daughter's behavior and the fact that I had never met this young man before, I thought this might get me into trouble. And Grace, Uncle Albert and his wife, apparently my only open allies, were far at the end of the table. So I returned Tamzon's grandfather to the place where I suspected he was sitting according to the original plan. Then he slid his on a hastily scribbled card next to Grace at the end of the table. I kind of decided that this seating arrangement was much safer. After returning from the photo shoot, Grace briefly fell into spoiled child mode. It had been a long time since I last saw her, and I found it oddly funny. I realized that this acting was inspired by my refusal to participate in the photo shoot. Well, if that's how you feel about it, I'm going to go to the bar. That was all I needed to say to quickly put an end to Grace's feigned protest. Just there. And I, Grace, objected. What will you do? Grace, I asked. I don't know, I kiss you. Maybe I've always wanted to do this, but I never had the guts. I always knew Eleanor's little sister was holding the candle for me, but I was surprised to hear Grace hint that she still carried that torch. Oh my God, Grace, I thought you'd long ago outgrown your stupid teenage hobbies. Oh, I've outgrown it. I even found someone who I considered the man of my dreams, but I soon discovered that not everything that glitters is gold, and what you see is not always what you get in the end. It was only after I divorced that bastard that I appreciated what my sister had so carelessly thrown aside. I'm not at all sure I understand what you were trying to say, Grace. Okay, the confused man is safe. She grinned. Let's go. It looks like everyone is sitting down at the table. The top table was prohibitively long, and Grace and her guests were originally located somewhere down the hierarchy. Although the witch rearranged everything, I reversed the changes much to the old bitch's confusion. Lots of fun, as far as I could tell. The witch seemed to accept my change without protest, but she gave me a withering look. Albert sat next to Grace. I thought that he began to comment when we arrived at our places. I thought our original plan would be a little more diplomatic. Sir, I interrupted Capital. I always knew that Hyacinth underestimated you, my boy. In any case, please drop the formalities for the family. I'm Bertie for most of the meal. Albert monopolized my conversation, ignoring everyone nearby, including his wife, but excluding Grace, who sat between us. He spent most of the meal asking me pointed questions about my travels. I almost felt like I was on the witness stand. Well, he was a top-notch lawyer who was used to cross-examining people. Well, let's see how they do, Albert commented, leaning back in his chair as the master of ceremonies called for silence for the formal toasts. Grandfather Tamzon, having given her out, stood up and made a short welcoming speech. Then the old scoundrel took me by surprise by passing the word to the father of the bride to say what something and propose a toast to the happy couple. I might add that, judging by the expressions on the witches' and Tamzon's faces, his proposal was not part of the master plan and was not approved, and it was definitely not welcomed by everyone. Keep in mind, as I said, the old fool caught me off guard, completely unprepared, so I was forced to quickly pull myself together and take action. In fact, I can't remember much, if anything, of what I said that day. I think he started by muttering something about unfortunate circumstances or something like that. But when I started talking about Tamzon, I came to my senses, remembering almost all the funny incidents from her life that I knew about. Anyway, it must have been a pretty good speech, and I guess it sounded pre-prepared, because I was shocked to find the whole damn room shaking with laughter. Hey, it could have been because I made such a fool of myself, and they laughed at me. But even the witch's face cracked at some point during my speech. Then remembering that I was breaking the magic 7-minute rule, yes. In fact, I had one eye on the clock. The minute hand had never moved so slowly. I proposed a toast to my new son-in-law and his beautiful bride and then threw the bowl into the groom's court. Brilliant. Alex, how long did it take you to prepare this speech? Grace asked as I collapsed in my seat. Did it sound normal? I asked, unable to believe that I succeeded, capital. My boy Albert echoed. You might as well make a fortune performing at after-dinner parties. Looking at Albert, I thought he knew what he was talking about when it came to after-dinner conversations, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I don't know what happened after that, but I remember what seemed like an endless stream of people jumping to treating surprisingly long and often humorless treatises. There were also toasts to every Tom, Dick and Harry. You could think of including the Queen. I don't even know how they fit into the equation. Perhaps someone was trying to complete a seemingly endless cycle of routine speeches. I noticed that no other speaker matched the obvious excitement of my own performance. Come on, my boy. I have a small corner already chosen and reserved, Albert said as people finally began to leave the dining room. It was at this point that I began to suspect that Grace and her Uncle Albert had somehow pre-planned my day. It may have only been a rough sketch, but they clearly knew what they were doing and seemed to be working in unison. Uncle Albert's wife never said anything important to me, but she smiled pleasantly whenever our eyes met. Grace, again firmly taking me by the right hand, led me into the next room and to a table very close to the bar. Oddly enough for a wedding reception. This table was in its own little fenced-in area, sort of like the executive area you sometimes find in high-end nightclubs. I always thought it was pretentious and I felt out of place sitting there. A young woman who, it turned out, was Albert's personal waitress, quickly appeared and took our drink orders. I noted that almost everyone else had to queue at the bar to get refreshments. Few, if any, of them managed to catch the young woman's while trying to place an order with her. I also noted that at the far end of the hall there was a similar fenced-off place, but it was still empty. Later, however, I noticed that the witch, her husband and the groom's parents retired there from time to time. Soon after we were served our first round of drinks, attention began to be drawn to Sir Albert Stone. Numerous younger members of the Stone clan, some of whom I had met at my own wedding many years ago, came up to introduce their mostly charming, but sometimes disgusting offspring to Uncle Albert. Then, having carefully broken their caps in front of the family patriarch, they again plunged into the anonymity of the crowd. The pointless pantomime bored me to the point of stupor and must have lasted almost an hour. During all this time, Albert said almost nothing except repeating his favorite phrase, capital, capital. Sometimes he even added a third word, capital, for greater persuasiveness, Honestly, if all this chatter wasn't so ridiculous, this might be funny. I tried to ignore the pantomime and probably would have walked away if Grace hadn't been holding onto my hand for dear life. And unfortunately Albert decided to make sure that all our visitors were reminded and in some cases informed that I am Tamzon's biological father. I truly believe that Albert's intention was to inform those who thought otherwise that he had decided to revoke my previous status as a family outcast. Whenever I tried to ignore what was happening next to me while chatting with Grace, Albert would introduce another family member, whether they already knew me or not. There was one brief break in the show of fawning, as Tamzon was twirled around the dance floor by her young husband. No, at that time I was not invited to dance with anyone, which was quite convenient in a way, because I'm not that good at the old formal things, especially when the spotlight is on my partner. And I think this is the last one, Albert said with relief in his voice, as the last small family group left our enclave. And now, my boy, I really think we'd better get down to the serious business of today. We cannot allow your daughter to dress her father the way she did before. Damn daring for a kid. It would have been great if years ago you had been there to throw her over your knee and give her a good spanking. She definitely needed it, hell. This was exactly what her mother needed. George had always been too soft with Eleanor and now with young Grace. Oh, your health, Uncle Albert. Grace snorted. Oh, you weren't so bad, Grace. But still, I have to admit that sometimes I could be a cheeky little naughty girl, sometimes forcing your parents to tediously reprimand you. I was never as bad as Eleanor, Uncle. No, and I admit it, Grace, but I'm sure that if William had thrown Eleanor over his knee and spanked her the first time she stepped out of bounds, everyone's life would have been much simpler, including her own. Knowing Eleanor, I would have spent most of this time behind bars. Albert, I intervened. Yes, you're right. Perhaps it would have happened. William Eleanor was a law unto herself and demonstrated a clear lack of common sense and conscience on occasion. On occasion, Grace asked okay. Perhaps too often Albert agreed. In any case, young man, it's time to restore your relationship with your daughter. Albert waved his hand casually and our waitress appeared. He whispered something to her that I didn't hear, and then she disappeared again. A few minutes later, Albert suddenly rose to his feet and ordered, "Come on, both of us. We can't do this in front of the whole crowd. Things can turn ugly." The big man then walked away towards the main foyer. The crowd on the dance floor seemed to magically clear a path for him. Grace, still holding my right hand with an iron grip, led me after him. I think I already mentioned that I think this day was planned in advance. This feeling was intensified by the fact that Albert led us to another, much smaller and almost completely deserted reception hall. What struck me as strange was the fact that the teenager who guarded this room and removed the rope obstructing the entrance as we approached turned out to be the same hotel employee to whom I had thrown a few shillings to gain access to the minstrel gallery. The hall was furnished so that it looked more like a lounge bar than a banquet hall, but without the actual bar. However, there were many large sofas, and on one hidden in the corner sat 3 people, 2 men and a woman. For some reason they seemed alien to me here, and I realized that they were not part of the wedding party to begin with. There were no white carnations on them, and I even managed to steal one of them before the service began. The woman, well, at first glance I took her for one of the hotel office workers. She looked like a very efficient and damn attractive young secretary. The remaining 2 guys were completely different. They were dressed elegantly but not overly so, and one of them seemed disturbingly familiar to me. I felt that I had seen this guy before and perhaps even talked to him, but I could not remember where and when. The second guy was a complete stranger to me, as was the young woman. Ignoring the 3 uninvited guests, Albert walked towards a group of sofas standing in a circle before he could sit down and indicate where he thought Grace and I should sit. Our waitress appeared with a tray laden with even more alcoholic beverages. "Uncle Albert, if you don't slow down with the drinking a little, I'll be drunk as hell before the end of the evening." William, drunkards are divided into several main categories: obnoxious, argue-rs or brawlers, boring, talkative drunks, stupid, drowsy drunkards, and more attractive, benevolent drunkards. I happen to know that you are usually classified as the latter type. Albert replied in his authoritative tone with a discouraging smile on his face. I had to admit that Albert was right in his description of my behavior when, under the influence of excess alcohol, I don't drink to excess anymore either. But I was very interested in how he could know about this fact. We didn't move in the same circles or anything like that. I've only met this man 4 or 5 times in my entire life. You seem to know a lot about me, sir, of course, young man. After what happened, I felt obligated to look after you, even though I couldn't do anything else. I could make sure you didn't get into any more trouble. I don't understand, sir. Leave the formalities. William, I'm on your side and it was always there. Didn't Grace assure you of that? I must have nodded or something because he continued. Capital now. Be patient a little longer, young man, you see now, and everything will become clear to you, hope. I also hope that you will understand my position and can find the strength in your heart to forgive me for not acting sooner now. You've really confused me, Bertie. My answer brought a smile to the old man's face, but it didn't stay there for long. His gaze moved to the far end of the room following him. I saw the witch and George enter the living room. They were quickly followed by Tam's Anne and her husband. All 4 of us walked up and were ordered to sit on adjacent couches across from us. Albert's gaze then returned to the entrance to the living room. It was obvious that he was expecting someone else to join us. What does this all mean, Bertie? Why did you call us here like this? We have guests to take care of, the witch demanded. Please calm down. Hey, Th. If it weren't for your intervention, I'm sure this wouldn't have been necessary. Helena was an irresponsible young woman who made an unintentional mistake that she was willing to admit until you talked her out of it. I do not understand what you're saying. The witch began to rant, but her husband shocked her into silence. Hush, Th. Betty is absolutely right, George snapped back. Lord, the dumb man has spoken. I thought to myself this was something I certainly did not expect. At that moment, a man in a black suit with a high stiff collar entered the living room. I immediately recognized him as another prominent member of the Stone clan. The Roman Catholic priest whose name was Father Connor was clearly a decent Irishman. However, I had never been able to pinpoint where he fits into the Stone family tree. As far as I knew, everyone else in the Stone clan was strictly Protestant. Be that as it may, this man was always pleasant to me on the few occasions when we met. I should add that whether he was of a different faith or not, Father Connor occupied the same patriarchal position in the family clan as Sir Albert Stone. However, while the crowd was coming to see Albert in the main hall, I saw Connor's father a couple of times diligently making his rounds among the family members. Albert rose to his feet to greet Father Connor, and then the priest turned to me, then shook my hand. I jumped to my feet the same moment Albert did. I'm glad you decided to attend today, William. You did a great job with that speech, young man. Of course your daughter was surprised to learn that you were so familiar with her life story. As he spoke, Father Connor glanced quickly at Tamzon. My daughter looked somewhat embarrassed. Thank you, Father. I hope you are doing well as the good Lord intended, William. So Grace, have you been avoiding me today? The noble father turned his attention to her. I waited patiently for him to finish with Grace, and then we all sat back down. Uncle Albert cleared his throat noisily as if to say, let's get down to business. The Father Connor spoke first. Bertie, do you understand what confidentiality of confession is totally? Joe Albert answered. Until recently, my actions were similarly limited. However, I believe I have been able to think of a way out of our shared predicament very well. As long as everyone understands that I cannot reveal anything that was told to me in secret. Father Connor repeated. Albert directed a friendly glance at Tamzon. Lily, do me a favor, if you wouldn't mind. I would like you to imagine that we are here in a courtroom and that you are testifying. You are taking an oath, if you understand what I mean. Yes, Uncle B. Eerie. But I don't. Lily began to answer. I don't expect you to understand, Tamzon. Not yet. I hope everything becomes clear to you soon. If this does not happen, then this whole pantomime will be a waste of time. I just want you to answer my questions as fully and honestly as you can under the circumstances. What I'm about to ask you to tell me will still remain just rumors, so it won't have legal force in a proper court. So will you do me a favor? Good, Uncle Bertie. Right now I would like you to tell us everything you know about the breakdown of your parents' marriage. Hey wait, Bertie. I tried to intervene. Shut up. Alex. This is my playing field. Albert warned me to be honest. I was completely taken back by this reproach, not so much because Albert cut me off like a judge, more because he addressed me as Alex. Now Tamzon, please continue. Albert continued. Albert, she was just a child at that time. You're asking too much of Tamzon, exclaimed the witch. You know, you're probably right. Hyacinth, Albert agreed. Why don't I tell you this story? As far as I remember, you went there and were old enough to understand what was happening. I'm sure you've repeated this story often enough over the years to know it by heart. I don't think I can answer the witch for the first time in all the time I saw her. She seemed unsure of herself and even looked embarrassed. Oh, but I'm sure you can. Hyacinth, your diatribe against William has been your signature number for many years now. Albert's apparent attack on her grandmother stirred something in Tams, and she suddenly straightened up. I'll tell you, Lily began to say, but Albert stopped her. He seemed adamant that the witch tell the story. I don't understand why, but I have to assume that Albert's initial request to Tamzon to tell the story was some kind of legal stunt designed to achieve the I don't know what. How legal minds work is often a mystery to us mere mortals. In the end, the witch relented, although she kept her eyes off me the entire time she spoke. I'm not going to repeat Hyacinth's actual words here. Some of what she said was completely out of chronological order anyway, and much more that was inconsequential, having virtually no meaning or relevance to the actual events of the time. However, I will try to tell the relevant points of the story, as the witch told it that day. So the witch's diatribe. Shy and William stayed in America for a couple of months working on the film. It was Eleanor's first feature film, and William was working as a C assistant or something like that. Larry Parker, the director of the film, was very impressed with Eleanor's acting skills and told me that she would soon become a big star. We thought everything was going very well calling home. Eleanor was very excited about her big movie break, although the presence of 18-month-old Tamzon, as it turned out, complicated the situation somewhat. Shona said a couple of the girls on the crew were very helpful and looked after Tamzon while she was on set. But then one evening everything changed. They called us on the phone and said that William had left home and got drunk as hell. He returned to the cabin. He and Eleanor shared where she rehearsed her lines for filming in the following days. With Larry's help. For some inexplicable reason, William went crazy and attacked Eleanor and poor Larry with a broken chair leg. Luckily, Larry was able to overpower William, knocking him out before he could kill them both. As far as I understand, William was completely out of his mind. However, Larry was unable to stop William from breaking Eleanor's cheekbone. Poor Larry didn't have a good time either, because William gave him a very nasty black eye. The police, of course, opened a criminal case against William for assault, but I took Tamzon to the UK before the case went to court. As far as I know, he was sent to prison, but I have no idea for how long, and of course he was deported back to the UK after serving his sentence. After William beat her, Eleanor divorced him. What else could the poor child do? No woman should be subjected to this kind of treatment from her husband. It was assumed that Helena would have another, much more important role in the film, which would be shot in Hollywood. This was arranged by Larry, but before filming began, her face still hadn't healed properly, so she missed out on the opportunity. William's rampage that evening cost Helena her chance to make it big as the actress she was destined to become. The poor girl was so scared of what William would do when he returned into the country that we were forced to get a court order to keep him away from her. Over the years, as everyone knows, there have been all sorts of legal disputes, but we haven't seen William outside the courtroom from that day to this. The witch, looking quite pleased with herself, sat back on the sofa, effectively declaring the story over, but I noticed that she still didn't look me in the eyes. I was convinced that she could not do this, because she was well aware that the story she had just told was neither the full story nor an accurate account of events in the States. That weekend, I didn't sit quietly listening to the witch's diatribe. Like Albert wanted me to several times, I wanted to challenge, add or correct details that the witch either ignored or didn't know. However, Grace, still holding my right hand tightly, seemed to sense. Every time I began to lose my patience, she squeezed my hand, and almost at the same moment, they must have been communicating in some way. Her uncle Albert gave me a sign to be silent. "You seem to be very cruel when you get drunk," William Albert made an observation. "It's very difficult for me to believe this. It's also quite strange that you managed to avoid prison for how long?" "For 22 years. I nodded, confirming Albert's assessment. "It's also quite strange that I haven't had any reports of you losing emotional control when you're under the influence of alcohol. For those of you who don't know, I have certain associates who have been keeping a wary eye on William for years and William for a while. You were, well, let's face it, you were a little wild. Be that as it may, I have a feeling that William's interpretation of events will give things a slightly different flavor. Why don't you enlighten us on how you, William, felt about that fateful weekend?" I pulled my hand away from Grace's and moved forward a little in the seat. I didn't want it to accidentally interrupt me or disrupt my train of thought, but without the comforting feeling of Grace next to me, I suddenly felt completely naked. Then I looked straight at Tamzon, because I needed her to be the one to understand what your grandmother said was not true from the very beginning. For the second part of this film, my friend asked me to act as a cameraman. It was supposed to be an action movie, the action of which would take place in the mountains. The second, as Shalon was tasked with filming all the deleted footage, very often with stand-ins instead of the main actors. This has always been my strong point: long-distance shooting and working with the telephoto lens. They paid for Eleanor to fly to the States only because I refused to fly without her. I thought this would be a nice free vacation for Eleanor. The film crew occupied what looked like a winter recreation complex. It probably cost them little because we were filming outside of their regular season. I never thought for a minute that Eleanor would be asked to replace an actress who broke her leg on the first day of filming. They even had to do some creative rewriting of the script to turn a small role into a female character. Eleanor had previously appeared in a couple of television commercials. Well, she was in the right place at the right time, so to speak. It was cheaper to use her than to find and then invite another actress. Oh, and they cut out her skiing scene burnt on milk blowing on water. If you know what I'm getting at. I was completely unaware of what was going on behind my back, although I knew that Larry Parker must have had sex with some naive young woman on the crew. That's Larry's way. He was notorious in the industry for his philandering manners. Besides, I thought Parker was my friend, and I made the mistake of thinking that friends don't seduce their friends' wives. That Friday we completed location shooting. Everything else was supposed to be filmed in the studio. Eleanor's character was not required for any of these remaining shoots. In fact, she only had a very small part. Anyway, on Friday afternoon, the rest of my team and I had to pack up all of our gear, so it was ready to return to the rental company. All technical equipment is rented, it's needed. Anyway, packing went better than planned, and we packed everything much earlier than I expected. I returned to the hut that Eleanor and I shared at about half full, although I didn't think I'd be back before 10 in the evening. But when I got there it was empty. No loving wife. No sleeping child. All I found was a note. Here it is. I took out my wallet and handed Tam a tattered piece of paper. However, Albert took it from my hands. He slowly and very carefully unfolded what was left of the document. Then I read the words scrawled on it aloud. Alex, I'm going to Larry's. He loves me and is going to make me a big star in Hollywood. Please don't follow us or make a shasher. And to the point, Albert commented. Go ahead, William. I believe we already see where this is going. So you say the location shooting is over? Yes, sir. That's how it was. I answered then. It's a lie that Eleanor was rehearsing lines for the next day of filming. Isn't it okay? Go ahead, Guy, let's get to the dirtiest part. You only have his word for this. The which part? How do you know Hugh's not lying? Quite right. Ian, Albert conceded. Let's see if we can't check a few facts. Albert looked at the three strangers. Reginald, if you don't mind. A man who did not seem familiar to me stood up and approached us with a briefcase in his hands. Sir, he turned to Albert, barely approaching a comfortable distance. Do you have copies of the shooting script for this film? Reginald didn't answer with words. He took a folder out of his briefcase and handed it to Albert, didn't even bother to open it. He casually tossed it onto the coffee table with the sofas around it. If anyone wants to dispute what William has said so far, he will find that it is confirmed by the contents of this folder. Now continue. William, please. For a few seconds I was confused. The interruption disrupted my train of thought. I literally had to control my emotions before I continued. When I found this note, I just still got apoplectic. Yes, and had a couple of drinks to calm my nerves. But then I realized that I had to return to camp that same evening, but much later. Moreover, I remembered that when we returned to the camp, I saw Larry's rental car parked in front of his cabin. Then it dawned on me that Shy and Larry might have miscalculated, thinking they'd be long gone before I found the note. I had no idea what the smartest thing to do in such circumstances would be. I do know that I wanted to at least get Eleanor to explain what game she thought she was playing. Parker, I was sure, would leave Eleanor the moment he caught sight of the next stupid little. I really couldn't believe that Eleanor had forgotten everything I told her about how this man acted. I wasn't stupid enough to introduce my wife to Parker without first preparing her God. When the slimy bastard turned on his charm, even the damn birds flew out of the trees towards him anyway. I found them in the kitchen of Larry's house. I wasn't really interested in Parker. I could deal with him any time. It's not like he could hide from me for long while staying in the industry. If you know what I mean. I wanted Eleanor to explain why she didn't take my warning seriously. However, Larry Parker misjudged my intentions. Other spouses may have come after him in the past. Anyway, to be honest, he came at me like the proverbial bull in a goddamn china shop. I simply stepped to the side and Parker rushed past me and crashed into the back door, breaking the glass in the process. For a moment I thought Parker was trying to escape. Later in court it was stated that I broke this glass when breaking into the hut. The fact that there was shrapnel on the floor outside and I didn't have a cut on my arm, like Larry did, was apparently ignored. Of course, it was also hampered by the fact that I could remember very little about the day when I first regained consciousness, and I had been regaining consciousness for several years. However, now I can remember all this in great detail. I don't know how to describe Larry Parker's fighting technique, because it doesn't fit into any category that I know of. Be that as it may, as soon as he came to his senses after crashing into that door, he rushed at me again. I stepped out of the way again, but managed to kick him as he flew past. I thought it might cool him down a bit, or something big mistake. My blow changed the direction of the exhaust of his rage. Parker slammed into Eleanor and then the two of them collapsed to the floor. Eleanor was still somewhat surprisingly from my perspective, sitting on a stool next to the breakfast bar. I believed that this must have been the very chair that did not survive the impact. I actually thought Parker was offside and Helena didn't look too healthy either, so I pulled Parker away from her, held Helena at her feet. I remember Helena looking into my eyes, obviously stunned, and then the damn light went out. I woke up for days later and found myself confined to a hospital bed. I didn't remember anything about the day in question or the few days leading up to it. The memories returned very slowly over the next months and years anyway. Time's on. These are my memories of that fateful day. Everything that has happened since then has been completely out of my control. I have no idea who hit me or with what, and I came to the conclusion that it was Larry Parker's head that broke your mother's cheekbone when he crashed into her. I assumed that it was he who hit me on the head, breaking my skull with the leg from the broken chair on which Eleanor was sitting. Why they both decided to blame me for the fight, I have no idea. Ever since then, your mother, with the help of lawyers, has made sure that I can't get close enough to ask her. I heard that Larry Parker was found dead of gunshot wounds in a motel room in Los Angeles while I was still enjoying the hospitality of the U.S. prison system, so I couldn't ask him either. I strongly suspect that Parker chose the wrong life for his dead. It seemed that Larry Parker had suddenly discovered that some Americans could be extremely possessive and quite vindictive. They can also be quite fanatical about using firearms. I leaned back on the sofa. I had nothing more to add so as not to seem too vindictive towards the mother of my daughter. Grace grabbed my right hand again and surprised me by kissing my cheek. Lily sat silently and looked at me. It felt like she was trying to look straight into my brain. Then suddenly she turned her gaze to Albert. You know what really happened, don't you, Uncle Albert? Mom told you, didn't she? Tamsin then instantly turned her piercing gaze to Connor's father. She told you she did it, my child, but like your Uncle Albert, my hands were tied. Father Connor replied, we have no right to disclose anything that is communicated to us in the strictest confidence. In my case, it's a confessional. In Albert's case, attorney-client privilege added new husband Tamsin. This was the first time I realized that the guy spoke American. His mother and father most definitely did not speak. In the British legal system we use a different term for it, young man. But in essence this comes down to the same limitation of actions. Albert assured him, Tamsin, I'm sure mother wouldn't lie to you. The witch then read. Lily jumped to her feet and then glared at her grandmother with hostility. She moved so that she could look her straight in the eyes. I'm sure of it too, Grandma, but in reality my mother never explained to me what happened then. All the information I got from somewhere else. Whenever I asked my mother about this, she always changed the subject or avoided it in some other way. Suddenly Tamsin turned on her heel, crossed the room where the three strangers were sitting and addressed them, and I found familiar. I know you don't, she demanded. Yes, young lady. That may be so, the man replied. Uncle Albert hinted that he had someone who looked after me. I remember seeing you more than once at my school. I'm also sure I saw you in Bristol a few times while I was at university. Perhaps Mr. Man conceded so, given the fact that my uncle implied that he had someone looking after my father as well, and I know that Reginald and Shirley, who are here, both work in my Uncle Albert's London office. I suspect that it was you who were following my father as well as me. Am I right as required? Yes, miss. You're right, the man answered. So who are you, a private detective? I'm a retired police officer. Miss, the one your uncle turns to when he requires my specialized services. Lily turned, looked me straight in the eyes and smiled. Then she turned back to the man. I would assume that you have studied very carefully the events of that evening sometime in the past. The man agreed with this, nodding his head. Then could you tell me whether you believe that my father is an honest man? Did he lie to us today? As far as I know, miss, no, the man answered. Thank you, officer. It's a pity that you didn't identify yourself, retired Sergeant White. Miss Jock for friends. Thank you, Milk. I don't understand why Uncle Bertie didn't just send you to tell me the truth. I only do what I'm asked to do, miss. And could you shed some light on why it was necessary for my Uncle Albert to remain silent for so long? I can only hazard a guess, miss, but I would guess that your uncle was defending some unnamed character from a charge of perjury. But why did she even feel the need to perjure? I really can't tell you that, miss. However, I think that a film producer could not promote a young actress if he himself was locked in a prison cell and charged with causing grievous bodily harm or whatever the American equivalent calls it. Suddenly everything makes sense. Lily exclaimed, "How long have you known this father?" She turned around to look at me. "I didn't know Tamzon, but I suspected," I replied. "I don't know how seriously your mother was injured that evening, but from the very beginning I was not sure that she remembered the events as clearly as she claimed in court." Perhaps Eleanor repeated the story. Parker fed her to the police. Lily turned back to Jackie. "May I invite you and your colleagues to be my husband and our guests of honor for the rest of the evening?" She asked all three of them thanked Tamzon, and then she literally ushered them into the main banquet hall. Then she slowly walked back across the room towards us, looking me straight in the eyes the entire time. "Lily," the witch began again as she came closer. "Please don't say anything now, Grandma. I'm too angry and I might say something I'll regret later. Grandpa, could you take your wife out and take care of the guests? Paul and I will be leaving soon without a word." George lifted the witch to her feet and led her out. Tamzon then walked over and hugged Father Connor, followed by her Uncle Albert. She didn't speak to them, but just hugged them. Then she turned to Grace and me. "Can I get you away from my father for a moment? And Grace, I'd like to talk to him alone." Then she turned to her husband, Paul, and Grace loves to dance. The guy understood everything just like Grace. Once they were out in the main banquet room, Tamzon led me the same way Grace had done all day, made our way to the hotel garden for a very long time. Tamzon didn't actually say anything. She just held my left hand very tightly, but in the end she asked Ted, "How can I ever apologize to you?" Her face slightly embarrassed, wifey embarrassed. I asked for what, baby. She stopped and I turned to look her in the face. "Well, for the way I spoke to you earlier, I guess. But I feel like I need to apologize to you for a lot of things. If only I could understand exactly why, I would feel much happier. The truth is, baby, it's you who owe the apology. You and I are victims. All we need now is to make up for lost time." I replied. "You don't seem very angry, Father." "I've had many years to learn that being angry doesn't do anything to improve a situation, Tamzon. And the only thing it can do is lead to some really deep, believe me. We swam. We know. But Grandma, your grandmother never liked me, Tamzon. Ever since your mother and I first started dating." "But why? What have you ever done to upset her?" "I was not born, as your grandmother thinks, into her circle, Tamzon." And he looked after her daughter. "Snobbery. Plain and simple. Can I hope that my father will look in on me?" "I hope so, baby, but I won't be here all the time. Remember that most of my work is related to Antarctica. I spend most of the year there. Somehow, I don't think my Aunt Grace will like this. She seems to have a slight crush on you." "What happened to her husband? I seem to remember that she got married." I asked. "Okay, that's not true." Grace hinted that she was married. I just wanted to get a little backstory without actually asking. Her Lily giggled. "Oh yes, I did. He was a handsome guy too, but to death-ed with his fists." "What do you mean by that?" "They argued about something and he hit Grace Lord." "What did she do?" "Father, do you remember how Aunt Grace told you that she was bullied at school?" "Yes, definitely. I took her to the gym and taught her how to defend herself." "Well, Grace's ex-husband felt the effects of your mentoring. He was taken away in an ambulance." "Then, did Grace suffer any consequences with Uncle Bertie as your lawyer? Her ex got 2 years probation in any port during a storm." My love, I'm ready to get my head married by a damn rabbi, if you ask me. Besides, I have this. Grace held the envelope up so I could see it. Please tell me what's in this envelope. Grace. The tickets for a cruise. A luxurious room. No less that my great-uncle paid for. And it just so happens that this is the same cruise on which a certain man's daughter and her new husband are going to spend their honeymoon. So you can get to know your daughter over the course of a few days and we can have sex every night. Grace. When did you and good old Bertie start planning this Shanghai exercise? Or whatever you like to call it, to be completely honest with you. Alex Bertie came up with the basic plan after Shona's funeral. Of course, my Uncle Bertie did not interfere with my seduction of you. It was entirely my idea and it fell under the heading of preferred consequences. So what do you think of this cruise? Now I looked down again and saw a longing expression on Grace's face. I think I'm going to enjoy my vacation while still doing my job, honey. However, we will not be able to obtain the marriage certificate until the ship departs. Don't worry about it, Alex. I checked, it's registered in Bermuda. And what is the significance of this fact? You'll soon find out. Hubby, you'll soon find out now. How about one more lap around the deck? Before breakfast, she grinned. I smiled back at Grace. We skipped breakfast that morning. Life goes on. Grace and I didn't get married on the ship. Although she and she were delighted with this idea. Beardy's wife did not want it. For such an outwardly demure old lady, Beatrice can be extremely strong when she wants to be. Not surprising, really, considering exactly who she's been married to since time immemorial. Beatrice organized our wedding. I'm sure Bertie paid for everything personally. Okay, it wasn't as big as Tamson's big wedding, but neither Grace nor I wanted it that way. Frankly, we both would have preferred a private affair on board a ship with only Tamson and Paul as witnesses. The witch was not present at our wedding, but Grace was given in marriage by her father. This scoundrel even sarcastically handed me his daughter's hand. This is becoming a habit. William Bertie Capital spent the entire day with a huge smile on his face, even claiming during his speech that he is the one responsible for bringing the bride and groom together, which I suppose it was in a way, although I do believe that ultimately, if I hadn't snuck into Tamson's wedding, Grace's determination would have brought us together some other way. My wife, when she knows what she wants, seems to be able to move mountains to get it. And of course she can bend her Uncle Bertie to her will, which is no mean feat. Her only problem seems to be that Grace spends so much time thinking about things. For example, are we getting up already, or should we take another short lap around the deck first? Which brings chaos to my work schedule. I can assure you again, age. I'm not as young as I used to be, no matter how much my wife chooses to believe otherwise. Yes, but I don't work in the South Seas anymore. Bertie knew someone who knew someone whose brother is a commissioned producer in the BBC Wildlife Department. Suddenly I discovered that Grace's phone was increasingly filled with offers to work on wildlife shoots. These are mostly UK locations too, and they are all somewhat profitable to a moderate extent. Just my thing. Grace and I decided that children were off the table. We feel the Tamsin twins will be enough for us. That's assuming he and Paul don't start a football team. We stayed in a quaint little bungalow just around the corner from Paul and Tamson's house. In any case, a convenient distance for the stroller, and Bertie elbowed Paul and me into the local golf club. Our Sunday morning for some became routine. Who is the fourth member? Well, listen with us. Of course, George. Now that he and the witch were no longer husband and wife, he had been elevated, or rather restored in my daughter's eyes, to the rank of second grandfather. Bertie of course perches on the highest perch, well being the family patriarch. What did you expect? Life goes on. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.